Jolani has a 10 million bounty on his head, but people are also aware that the United States never enforced that bounty. In fact, Emin Dean, who's a former MI6 spy and the author of the book Nine Lives and a very reputed scholar on the Middle East, makes this very interesting argument where he says that the Rewards for Justice program of the United States, which has issued the bounty on his head, has also issued similar bounties on a vast number of other leaders whom arguably Jolani helped defeat and kill. So, in a way, the United States even owes money to Jolani. But
You're on the gist on StratNewsGlobal. Welcome. Hello, I'm Surya Gangadharan, and my guest for this show is Bashir Ali Abbas. He's a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center. He was with the Takshashila Institution, and he's also with the Council for for Security and Defense Research, a think tank based in Delhi. Bashir, good to have you.
happy to be here.
Bashir, good. Bashir, I'm sure you've been watching the developments in Syria over the last few days. The Hayat Tahrir Al-Sham and Jolani, its boss. What is your reading of the group and the man?
Well, I think that's a good point of departure for a conversation on Syria, where evidently a lot of change has taken place in a matter of very few days. But I think when we talk about Jolani, the best place to start with is his name. I mean, I'm sure you also know, but his actual name is Ahmed al-Shara, and people usually know him by his other name, which is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. But interestingly, what al-Jolani actually refers to is the Golan Heights of Syria. So he's quite
Yeah.
literally the man from Jolan. Now, there's a reason why he changed his name, especially when he embarked on his jihadist journey with Al Qaeda, because he was born in Saudi Arabia, spent 7 years there. His father had a big history of involvement with political Islam, first with Nasserism and then towards a more nationalist uh, inklings of several jihadist groups, especially in Iraq and Syria. But Jolani himself was born in the village of Quneitra in southern Syria. So
Mhm.
when Jolani becomes a part of Al Qaeda after having been radicalized like many others after the Second Intifada in Palestine, he eventually becomes Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's sort of right hand man in Iraq. But
Mhm.
interestingly, earlier, Jolani spent quite a lot of time in Iraqi prisons, including the infamous Abu Ghraib prison, where he coincidentally was also jailed with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But
Mhm.
once Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi sort of launches into his own efforts in terms of establishing the Islamic State of Iraq after two of its initial leaders are killed, al-Jolani is sort of dispatched into Syria to establish Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria. However, we see that right from the early 2010s onwards itself, rifts start to show up between Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Abu Muhammad al-Jolani because Jolani starts thinking, and he expresses this in a letter to al-Baghdadi, who was then about to establish the so-called Caliphate, Islamic State, where he says that Al-Qaeda's ideology-driven globalist approach is not pragmatic and not useful. So
Mhm.
right from the beginning of the last decade, you see Jolani becoming a little more focused. Now, eventually, across that decade, he changes the name of his outfit, which was first Jabhat al-Nusra, which is very much a jihadist organization and
Yeah,
is
yeah,
known for its
absolutely.
brutalities. He first changes it to something called the Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, which translates to the movement for the liberation of Sham or the Levant, which primarily starts in Syria. Uh, Eventually, once Mosul falls and once ISIS is sort of defeated after the Battle of Bahus Farkawi, what Jolani does is goes public with his desire to link up even more integrally with other Syrian rebel factions who are not really Al Qaeda. So he
Mhm.
changes it again to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But, and I'll conclude with this, by 2019, Jolani issues a very interesting directive to almost all of the rebel fighters and jihadists fighting in the Idlib province in northern Syria that these areas in Syria are not to be used as a staging ground for attacks against European states or any other state in the world, right? So you have these clear breaks from the Al Qaeda way of doing things, right?
Mhm.
So while I mean Jolani himself belongs to the Abu Musab al Zarqawi school of jihadism, so there is no whitewashing his brutality. But in terms of strategic objectives, there's
Mhm.
a very clear chronology in terms of how he deviated from Al Qaeda. Now, one can get into a lot of comparisons in terms of other groups and how HTS is behaving today, but I'll leave that for later in the conversation.
Mhm. So HTS, what is it that you've read about it and how it has behaved, especially in a place like Idlib?
Right. So, as I said, the HTS itself was born out of this transformation that Jolani was trying to force in a top-down manner, and he was largely successful. But he was helped crucially by both Turkey as well as other Western states, especially the United States. I mean, by now it's splattered all over the papers that Jolani has a 10 million bounty on his head, but people are
Yeah.
also aware that the United States never enforced that bounty. In fact,
Mhm.
Emin Dean, who's a former MI6 spy and the author of the book Nine Lives and a very reputed scholar on the Middle East, makes this very interesting argument where he says that the Rewards for Justice program of the United States, which has issued the bounty on his head, has also issued similar bounties on a vast number of other leaders whom arguably Jolani helped defeat and kill. So, in a way, the United States even owes money to Jolani. But the point of the matter is that the United States and Turkey were both fine with this. Right? Now, the reason why Turkey, especially, saw the HTS as an opportune partner in its operations in Syria, apart from the Syrian National Army, is not just because these forces could be instrumental in defeating Assad, but principally against the Kurds, right? So, what the HTS does is make good use of this sort of symbiotic relationship with Turkey in the north. And the point to note here is that Turkey, across the last decade, almost, I think 8 years now, has maintained its own buffer zone in northern Syria where it has
Yeah.
sort of run a proto state of sorts. So the HTS was flushed with arms and fun. Right? And of course, towards the end of the last decade, we know that Russia and Turkey sort of entered into a detente, which is why the Syrian Arab Army and the Assadist forces stayed off Idlib and didn't try to push towards a complete victory. They would have liked, but
Yeah.
Russia said, hold off. Russia and Turkey sort of came into this marriage of convenience. But very evidently, that arrangement, which everybody, including me and a lot of observers, took for granted, only allowed HTS and other groups to sort of marinate in a way where they can launch an offensive one day and how.
Mhm. Mhm. Jolani was on CNN, I think a day or two before Aleppo collapsed. So
Yeah,
give you an indication as to which direction he's going.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
um, Jolani has the fact remains HTS is an authoritarian organization, and they run a state in Idlib or whatever they run in Idlib, which for all its charitable activities doesn't allow women, I'm told, on their governing councils nor minorities, and it's pretty much quite brutal with dissidents. So not very different from what Assad has been doing, isn't it?
Yes, but the question is of scale. I mean, I'm sure you're seeing the videos that are coming out of the
Yeah, yeah,
Sinai prison in Damascus, where you
yeah,
have cells deep underground. So when it comes to the
absolutely.
Syrian people, the question is of both time and space, right? And Assad has ruled in Damascus for the past 50 years, right?
Yeah,
So the primary instrument of oppression for the Syrian people has always been Assad. Right
yeah,
now, when it comes to the Jabhat al-Nusra and the HTS, they have that liberty to change their identities because they are not the state, right? But
yeah,
the Assadist state never changed in character. Right?
true.
The Assad's first response to the protests in Dara in 2011 and the offshoot of the Arab Spring was sheer kinetic force. And the
Hmm.
Assadist regime sort of continued on that approach and never changed. But since you're still focused on the HDS, I think this is a good time to mention that very peculiarly, this seems to be an age where a lot of these Islamist Sunni jihadist outfits are rebranding themselves. Now, I know the
Uh-huh.
obvious point of comparison in our heads is the Taliban in Afghanistan,
Mm.
which made promises in Doha that seemed so democratic that one
Yeah.
could almost mistake them to be like any of the other Arab monarchies. But of course, it's another matter that they have only regressed on their promises and gone in the opposite extreme, right? But there are closer to Syria examples. For instance, if you look at the Libyan Islamist fighting group in Libya, that also went through a similar transition. But well, all of
Mhm.
us, we take our eyes off these states because there's just so much happening in the Middle East,
Yeah.
at any point in any month. But just briefly mentioning the LIFG, that also goes through a transition of this sort, right? Where it first starts off as a jihadist outfit, but today it's cutting deals with Western states, it's helping with illegal immigration, it's
Yeah.
operating as a militant NGO, if, for the lack of a better word. So you have this delinking from the Al Qaeda-esque global jihadist outlook to more focused, pragmatic, self-preservationist approaches that all of these groups are mounting. I mean, as an example, and perhaps this is the best reflection of what this group is trying to do, is not just the interviews to CNN, which is the most obvious example, but look at the letters that HTS is writing to the governments of Iraq, the government of Lebanon, right? Jolani also making personal overtures to all of the minorities in Syria. These are very similar to the Doha promises that the Taliban had,
Yeah.
right? So this is a group trying to limit the immediate kinetic dangers to itself, especially now that the common enemy has been defeated. Now,
Yeah.
what happens from here onwards and how the HTS acts is anyone's guess. But I'll stop on this front with just one minor point, if you'll allow me, and that is that a lot of these intra-group arrangements are marriages of convenience. I mean,
Hmm.
we've heard of the Syrian National Army, which is sponsored by Turkey, and the HTS, both of whom sort of combined to launch this unified offensive. But if you look at some of the subgroupings within the SNAs, such as the Harar al-Sham, when the HTS was the Jabhat al-Nusra, they used to fight the Harar al-Sham,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of these jihadist groups have very flexible and fluid organizational setups. Now,
Hmm.
if you look at the offensives that were launched from the south, they organize themselves into a unified command literally in the middle of the offensive, right? So all of them are fluid. So once your common point objective, which is the fall of Assad, is done, the real questions only begin now. The foremost
What
question in
happened?
my mind is the degree of cohesion between these groups.
Hmm. Between these groups. Hmm.
Yeah.
Just a small digression. Hayat, Tahrir, or Sham. Sham is a word for the Levant. So we are
Yes.
basically
Yes.
talking of Syria, Lebanon. Is that it?
Yes, but it's almost metonymical, where when one says Sham, it technically means the Levant, but it usually means Syria.
Okay. Okay.
Which
Now
is why
let's.
when Islamic State started in Iraq, it was known as Islamic State in Iraq, but when it expanded into Syria, it called itself the Islamic State of Iraq
Yeah.
and Sham.
Hmm. Yeah. Let's move a little forward. The role of Iran here. We all know they've been perhaps debilitated by the war in Lebanon, and the fact that they've been on the back foot for some months now, after many of their own generals were knocked out by the Israelis and by others. And they did very little to counter those attacks. Iran may have even lost a lot of face and a lot of clout in that region. What is your assessment?
Look, I think it's tempting to think that Iran has been on the back foot now because of its recent losses of generals, especially with the Israeli strike on its Damascus embassy and consulate. But its first loss was in January of 2020 with Major General Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah,
Now, Qasem
absolutely.
Soleimani of the IRGC's Quds Force was not just any general. He was instrumental in building this web of proxy militias or H groups, as I call them, because you have the Houthis in Yemen, you have the Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, which are the Iraqi militias who serve as the connect between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And you have Hamas in Palestine, of course, which is slightly different case. But the point is that there are several internal and external pressures on Iran. Right? I'll start with the internal. The point is that the economic situation in Iran, despite Tehran's attempt at developing what it likes to call the resistance economy, was failing. Right?
Hmm.
When Ibrahim Raisi was elected as the president of Iran, he was sort of allowed to do so by the Guardian Council because he was largely looked at also as a successor to Khamenei himself, who's now rather old. But
Yeah.
if you look at Iranian media as well as commentary towards the end of Raisi's term before he was tragically killed in a helicopter crash, Khamenei was almost bordering on criticizing Raisi because being an authoritarian loyalist is one thing, but being economically efficient is another matter
Yeah.
entirely,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
So the language in which Iran started expressing itself started changing. Right? Iran has tried to make this distinction between its nuclear ambitions and sanctions relief. It has always
Mm.
said it's looked at sanctions relief without talking about its nuclear program. So and that is why the debate on enrichment continues. Now, once
Mm.
Raisi passed away and Pezeshkian was allowed to stand on the ballot by the Guardian Council and he won, that very evidently shows a desire, within Tehran to prioritize sanctions relief. But make no mistake, there are deep divisions in Iran today in terms of how to focus on its outward project of exporting the revolution, as it calls it, right? Which is known as the Mukawama, the resistance. Now,
Mm.
those divisions continue to exist. Right now, when it comes to the Iran-Syria relationship, I think that division has really manifested itself pretty strongly because the Iranians were sort of waiting to see how Assad reacts. Now, let's remember, Assad wasn't very proactive in this fight against Israel across the past year. You never really
Yeah.
saw any big offensives launched or attacks come from the Golan Heights. There has been this informal truce between Assad and Israel. And Assad
Yeah.
was sort of against starting to become his own man. He was welcomed with open arms into the Arab League, despite being expelled
Yeah.
from it all those years ago. Uh, so there was this disjunct that was starting to develop between Tehran and Damascus, with the latter showing these signs of autonomy. Now,
Mm.
while Iranians would have liked Assad to reach out, for help and everything else, it's curious that towards the end, in the final few hours before Damascus fell, Assad reaches out to Donald Trump, or rather the United States, right? And
Yeah.
and that triggers a very strong tweet by Donald Trump. And as we were discussing earlier, hardly any of Trump's tweets are not strong. But the point is that it is not a minor development that Iran's presumably strongest ally in the region reaches out to the Americans for help. Right?
Mm.
It's just a function of the larger changes in thinking in all of these capitals. But again, I'd like to finish with just one thought. It's again very tempting and easy for us to presume that Iran has lost face. But if you really think about it, across the past year, since October 7, 2023, it is only the Iran backed groups that have been actively fighting Israel.
Yeah.
Right? You have
Absolutely.
had Hezbollah from Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen have arguably been the most successful in
Yeah.
globalizing the effects of this conflict in Gaza. Now
Mm.
that has an effect on the Islamic world, right? There's a reason if you look at the recent OIC Arab League joint summits, everybody is calling for the protection of Iranian sovereignty and everything else because
Yeah.
there's a recognition of the continuing ability of these groups to harm their interests in a very asymmetric fashion. Right? It's all
Mm.
about money at the end of the day. A
Yeah.
Houthi rocket or a Houthi drone doesn't cost much, but if it hits an oil field in the UAE
Yeah.
or
It
in
matters.
Saudi Arabia, as it did all those years ago, it's a huge issue. So again, like anybody in this region, one shouldn't really write off either ability to influence events or their military capabilities on the ground. I think as of where things stand today, those military capabilities have evidently been weakened by both the actions of Israel in Lebanon and Turkey-backed groups in Syria. But this ability to change its approach and preserve its sphere of influence is something that is always the long game. So I think it's that should definitely be kept in mind while reading this situation.
Mhm. Would you say Turkey is the big winner here?
I don't know. there are no winners and losers in these things, right?
Hmm.
I mean, today I might think Turkey is the winner, but tomorrow it might seem very different. What the point here is that Turkey has always been a regional neighbor, right?
Hmm.
In these grand realignments in recent years in the Middle East, Turkey has been kept out. I mean, even in the
Yeah.
IMEC, Turkey doesn't figure anywhere, and Erdogan has not held back in terms of criticizing these projects because it leaves Turkey out, and Turkey has attempted its own east-west corridor to sort of counter this, right?
Yeah.
But Turkey is also part of the Astana process, which is the main peace process for Syria. And if
Yeah.
I'm not wrong, there was a joint Arab and Astana process statement just, I think, yesterday or a few hours ago, which Turkey also was a part of, which called for de escalation, invoked UNSC Resolution 2254, called for democracy in Syria and everything else, right? But the point is that Turkey has always been at the forefront of exploiting a good geopolitical window, right? I think it's easy to forget, but the moment people go back, it's also very readily evident that when the jihadist scourge of ISIS sort of presented itself in the last decade, Turkey wasn't really proactive in countering ISIS or its affiliate groups. Because in
Hmm.
Erdogan's mind, the point is that these groups are fighting the Kurds in Syria. And as
Yeah.
we all know, the Kurds are the principal opponents, at least in Ankara's mind, to Turkish national existence. Right. So my enemy's enemy is my friend has been the mantra for Turkey, and that has continued. Right. For Iran specifically, compared to even Turkey, their main interest has been the protection of the Shia shrines in Syria and Iraq. Right. And all of these shrines have always been the foremost targets of a lot of these Sunni and Salafi jihadist groups in
Yeah.
Iraq and Syria. So if there is a way that, regardless of the calculations vis-a-vis Turkey, if there is a way that Iran can secure the security of these shrines from any of these groups, right?
Hmm.
Then, to a certain degree, its immediate threats are mitigated. If these shrines are attacked, then that will be a loss of face, right? Because, and this requires a longer conversation, but the Iranian regime absolutely loves to appropriate elements of the Shia faith, which is very strongly intertwined with its style of politics.
Hmm.
And all of these shrines, which have always been, unfortunately, the targets of all of these Sunni and Salafist groups, play a huge symbolic role in how the Iranian regime presents itself not only to its own people but also to Muslims around the world, right? So while Turkey definitely is a geopolitical maverick, all of these other states have their own interests to look after. Certainly.
Hmm. Russia. They have a base in Tartus, and it would appear that their geopolitical clout has taken a huge knock with what we've seen happening in Syria. You share
Yeah.
that?
I do. I do. In fact, I think in a piece for the Express, I phrased it as this confluence of global conflict, right? Where the more immediate effect is the weakening of the Hezbollah because of its entire senior leadership being decimated. But
Yeah,
the
yeah,
principal armed force who turned the scales of war in Syria was Russia with its intervention in 2015. Now, until then, the Syrian Arab army was struggling. It was holding on to its lines, but it was struggling.
yeah,
Now, of course, post the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the questions over Syria were raised very early on, right? Because Russia had advanced air assets, not only in Tartus, which is a naval base, but also in Latakia, which is arguably, at least as of now, perhaps slightly more developed. Because for Russia, the point is that if it has to have access to its fleet in the Mediterranean, it has to rely on Turkey for passage through the Bosphorus Straits.
yeah. Hmm.
But as part of a number of legal arrangements, I think for all practical purposes, those straits are difficult to pass through today, especially because of
Yeah,
the Russia-Ukraine war. So across the past week, we have seen that Russian naval assets have first withdrawn from the base in Tartus, but also not really gone back and rejoined the Black Sea Fleet, right?
yeah,
So their exact position is unknown. But what is definitely clear is that Russia has pulled back. Even in terms of the Russian backed airstrikes that the regime was conducting against the rebels when they were sort of marching from Aleppo on that big NH4 highway to Hama. I think post December 3rd or 4th, the strike stopped. Right. I think, or even if they occurred, the frequency of the Russian strikes were severely diminished. Right. So I think it became increasingly clear to all of these states that Damascus was eventually going to be threatened. I would gamble and say that I think what people were really waiting for is the fate of Homs, right?
Yeah.
Because Homs really is that artery that connects Damascus with the Alawite
Yeah.
coastal heartland, which also
Yeah.
houses the main support base of Bashar al-Assad. But I think the moment Homs fell, everything became clear. Right? From then onwards to the fall of Damascus, it happened in an even shorter window.
Mhm. I'm curious. We don't seem to read of any advance on that Alawite redoubt, by the HTS, or is it still early?
Why do they need to do it? Right? In fact, their primary objective was Damascus. They have achieved that objective. Now,
Yeah.
after achieving this objective, if they go ahead and mount an offensive on these towns, whether Latakia or Tartus, what goal does it serve? Right?
Yeah.
You have the Russian bases there which are slowly drawing down, but for all practical purposes, such offensives would seem as reprisal campaigns against Alawite minorities.
Yeah.
Now, of course, because we unfortunately have the playbooks available in both Libya as well as countries like Afghanistan, such attacks cannot be ruled out. But if they are carried out, they will in almost all certainty be carried out because of sectarian reasons, but not for any strategic objective.
Mhm.
Unless the Unified Command, which is the Military Operations Command, feels that expelling Russia forcefully is a goal that they would like to engage in. Thus far, they haven't shown such signs. But
Yeah.
if we set that possible strategic objective aside, attacking these towns, will only perhaps cause more sectarian drive. Now, for now, in these very volatile days, I think the HTS would like to avoid that, or at least it
Mhm.
says it would like to avoid that, because it reached out to a very vast litany of sectarian groups, including the
Yeah.
Druze, the Ismailis, the Alawites. I mean, I think they just checked the list
Went
of
through the
Syrian
list.
ethnicities, and yeah, they included everybody. So how they change is anybody's guess, because they're not a single party, right? They are a number of groups that have come together under one umbrella and are even more diverse than say the Iraqi groups, which is known as the Popular Mobilization Forces. But again, they are very different in character, different politics, but just for the sake of analogy.
Mhm. So, after perhaps a period of calm, we could see again another churn of some kind. What's your guess?
Again, it's just so tempting to go back to Afghanistan because everybody was
Yes.
surprised the moment Kabul fell. There are
Yeah.
just so many parallels, at least in terms of imagery. But since then, Afghanistan has not known calm. And
Yeah.
Afghanistan has far lesser variables of conflict, if I may say so, compared to Syria or even the larger Middle East.
True.
In Syria today, where you have states carving up territories for themselves in both the north and the south, you have such a large array of both Salafi jihadist groups, Sunni separatist militant groups, Syrian nationalist groups, the Kurdish groups, as well as the Iran-backed Iraqi militias that often ventured into Syria but so far have stayed away. And you have Israel, which sort of, at least currently in terms of ideology, is the common enemy for most of these groups.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
The variables of conflict, the bones of contention are too many to count, right? So, I mean, if you plug at least a few of these gaps, there is no telling when any of those other fronts will open up, right? I
Mhm.
mean, it has always been a powder keg. The point is that we are discovering newer and newer powder kegs in this region every day, unfortunately.
Mhm.
So, there is no foreclosing the opportunity or the potential of more instability. Right? The HPS, therefore, has an active interest in projecting a stable transition into, a new government, right? Which is
Yeah.
why they
Yeah.
have been very careful. Right? In fact, they've reached out to the international community to sort of facilitate inspection of supposed chemical weapon sites that Assad was reportedly housing. All of
Yeah.
these are overtures to garner greater legitimacy that it would like to project for itself, right?
Mhm.
That unlike Assad, they are now, the avenue of channeling the aspirations of the Syrian people. How much they will succeed? If we were living in an ideal world, you could say that for any group or any new political party or regime, it will take time. Because, in a very benign sense, if even a full fledged democracy like ours, when you have every state election, we talk of anti incumbency.
Yeah.
Imagine a region that has seen 50 years of Assad rule,
Yeah.
right? Now, you cannot imagine if any, even the most benign group taking over cannot, have change overnight. And here you
Yeah.
have a group that has, that is still in the shadow of its former Al Qaeda self. So it's the number of layers are just, too many. But
Yeah.
if that helps.
So Syria will bear watching. Bashir, on that note, great talking to you. A lot of perspective there and fresh insight for all of us here. Thank you very much and look forward to having another conversation with you going forward.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. And that's all we have for you on this conversation. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.